Well, I know I say it every week, or at least I used to say it every week, but it is genuinely good to be with each and every one of you. I mean that sincerely from the bottom of my heart. For the last 2 months, every time I've done this, it's been to a completely empty auditorium, and so this has kind of been semi-awkward for me, or at least the first couple weeks were awkward, and then I kind of got used to it, and now seeing you people out here is kind of awkward to me. So this whole thing is kind of interesting to me. It's been an interesting change of pace. It kind of feels like the first day of school after summer vacation, where everyone's getting back together, everyone's talking about what you did over the summer. But it's good to be with each and every one of you. I enjoy looking out and seeing faces. I enjoy worshiping. Last several times we've had these kind of worship services that we've recorded, it's just been me and Nathan and two other dudes in here. So it's nice to hear other people singing. It's also good, and I need to mention this too before I go any further. I want to thank personally the men that have come up here to help record services. We had a number of men over the last 2 months that have come up to lead services. We had a number of men that were scheduled to lead services over the next couple weeks, and we had a number of men that were going to be scheduled to lead services in the coming weeks. So I want to say a special thank you to those men. If you've never tried to lead singing into a phone when there's nobody else here with a backdrop of a cappella singing over the loudspeakers, it is a little awkward. So I want to thank those men for being a part of that and for giving up some of their time. But we're back here now, and this is a good time for us to be together. It's a good time for us to enjoy one another's fellowship. So I'd encourage us to make the most of it. So we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 19, so I'd encourage you to open up to that. 1 Kings chapter 19, to kind of set the stage for what we're working with here in this passage. Most of us are familiar with this story. If you're familiar with the story of Elijah, you more than likely are familiar with what happens in 1 Kings chapter 18, chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 18 is that massive victory that Elijah has on Mount Carmel. This is the one where you have all the prophets of Baal, the prophets of Asherah that show up, and Elijah kind of has this victory over them, where the prophets of Baal are saying, this is our God, he's the one that's powerful, he's the one that we should be worshiping. And Elijah more or less stands up to all of them, and he says, God Almighty, Jehovah is the one that you should be paying attention to. And then you have that fire that comes down from heaven that laps up the sacrifice, that laps up the water all around the sacrifice. And it's just a magnificent display of God's almighty power in front of all of these people. I realize now I need to stand right here. I'm going to get outside of the camera screen, so I won't try to leave this section. It's a massive display of God's almighty power. But then the script flips a little bit. When you look into 1 Kings chapter 19, this is where Elijah kind of has this, and I want to say this woe is me section, because I think any of us, if we were in his shoes, would probably feel something very similar. But when you look at 1 Kings chapter 19, starting in verse 1, you have this context where it talks about Ahab and Jezebel basically launching a full frontal assault onto Elijah. You know that because the end of chapter 18, Elijah has essentially put all of her prophets to death. So chapter 19, Jezebel is getting her comeuppance. She's getting her revenge there in 1 Kings chapter 19. And then Elijah has something to say here starting in verse 4. It says, he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, so he wants to be completely alone. And he came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die, and said, it is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers. The one instance that phrase should come to mind as you read that should be the story of Job. In the story of Job, in Job chapter 1 and chapter 2, whenever Job has his entire life annihilated basically right in front of him, he expresses a very similar amount of grief that Elijah has here in 1 Kings chapter 19. And so if you think, as I wrongly said a second ago, that Elijah is just kind of having a little bit of a pity party for himself, you can kind of see that that's not exactly what's happening. Elijah is in a state of extreme emotional grief that he actually wants to be killed because he feels like he's useless. Verse 5, he lay down and slept under a juniper tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him, and he said to him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and laid out again, and the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise, eat and drink, because the journey is too great for you. So he arose and he ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. If the story stops here, it seems like it's more or less Elijah that is expressing this emotional grief as the result of the persecution that's going to come upon Ahab and Jezebel. And so he's expressing his sadness, his anguish over this thing. And it seems as if God comes down and gives him this food. He continues on about his way, and that's the end of the story. But that's not the end of what happens, because you see immediately there in verse 9 that he comes to another cave. He was in the wilderness originally. He comes to a cave. He lodges there, and the word of the Lord comes to him and says to to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Keep in mind, he had gone 40 more days on that food. And he said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with a sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." If you thought from the first 9 verses of 1 Kings chapter 19 that Elijah's pain and anguish all of a sudden just vanished, you can see that it returns here. And it returns with something new that you see here in these 2 verses that you don't see in the first several verses, which is that Elijah feels utterly alone. He feels completely by himself. He doesn't know anybody else is even standing for God. He feels like everybody's against him. It's a very sad place to be. And then when you look in verses 10 down through, I think about verse 16 or 17, you have this famous phrase that's talked about where God brings the mountain or brings the fire by. He says he's not in the fire. He brings the wind. He's not in the wind. He brings the hurricane. He's not in the hurricane. And then he brings this still small voice. And there's a lot of question as to what exactly God is doing in that instance. But I think when you look at this, especially in the context, what God is doing in that phrase is he's saying all these magnificent events that you see, that you think signify the fact that I'm with you, the fact that I'm standing right there next to you, I'm not necessarily in those. You know, sometimes we look for these big moments. Sometimes we look for these big kind of almost supernatural events in our life where we can only ascribe certain things to providence, and we say, that's God. And that's where we feel closest to God, is in those types of moments where we can more readily see him. And what God is telling him, I believe there in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 10 down to verse 16 is, I'm not necessarily in these big events. I'm right around you. And there's a statement that he makes here in 1 Kings chapter 19, starting in verse 15, that I think is interesting. In verse 15, he repeats the same phrase in verse 14, I alone am left. They've killed your prophets. I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And God says in verse 15, go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram, Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint king over Israel, which, by the way, Jehu is a fantastic story if you're looking for something to read this afternoon. Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place. You know, usually when I record these sermons, I can go back and try these words over and over again. I don't get to do that right now. But Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place, and it shall come about the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death. The one who escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death. But look at verse 18. Verse 18, God says, yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. I think what's interesting about this passage is there's a lot of attempts by God to kind of boost up Elijah. Elijah is feeling, in my opinion, probably the lowest he's going to be, at least than we can see in his recorded history. Elijah feels utterly alone, and over the span of about 2 months, you can see that it's not just purely an emotional thing, because twice, separated by at least 40 days, he asks God to take his life because, as he mentions there, I feel utterly alone. And then God comes to him there in verse 18 and reminds him of the fact that I have 7,000 people who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In other words, you are not alone, Elijah. You know, the last few months as we've been kind of quarantining, we've been kind of isolating in different places. I would argue, too, that we've probably all felt a little bit of a spiritual lull. We've been separated from each other. We haven't been able to gather together in this assembly, and there's still half our congregation that is not able to worship with us together in this assembly. But we've probably felt a little bit spiritually deflated. I would argue, too, and I would probably wager that for most of us, 2 months is about the longest period of time most of us have ever gone without assembling with the saints, except for maybe certain pockets of time. But at least as far as times when we're trying to be obedient and trying to be faithful to him, 2 months is probably the longest most of us have ever gone with not assembling. And if you're anything like me, you probably feel at least a little bit like Elijah does, where you kind of feel a little bit of a spiritual lull. Not that you don't necessarily feel like God isn't with you, not that you're somehow persecuted and stressed and in this severe sort of emotional anguish, but you just feel alone. For 2 months, at least, besides Melina, the only Christian that I've had really any interaction with is Nathan. I don't even really like him that much. So I've felt kind of that spiritual isolation I'm sure most of us had, and that elation that we have when we come together in times like this where we can worship God. And if you can put yourself in Elijah's shoes at this moment, I think we can kind of see what Elijah's dealing with here. Because as God informs him in 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 18, when he says, I have not, or I have reserved for myself 7,000 people that have not bowed the knee to Baal, my response, if I were Elijah, is, where are those 7,000 people? Where are they? Because I feel alone. I feel isolated. I feel segregated from everybody else. I'm working, I'm doing as much as I can, I'm pushing, and I'm being persecuted, but it's really, really tough. And what I really want at this point in time, if I'm Elijah, is I want to see those 7,000 people. I want to interact with some of them. I want to break bread with them. I want to sing worship songs with them. I want to pray with them. I want to have communion with them, which, by the way, this is the first communion that I've ever been a part of, where after we say the prayer, you hear all these little pops and crackles all throughout the auditorium. And certainly that was then bookended by somebody walking up and down the rows with trash cans, but that's a side point. That's our new normal for right now, so I think a lot of us have to get used to it. But I think all of us feel that sense of connection. We want that sense of connection. And that's, if I'm Elijah, that's where I'm at that point in my life. I think if we put ourselves in the shoes of Elijah, we feel a certain amount of kinsmanship with him, with that idea of feeling completely and utterly isolated. And you learn a couple of things from this story. Number one, I would argue that you learn that there is indeed strength in numbers. And anyone that doesn't agree with that statement, and I mean this in the kindest possible way possible, anyone that doesn't agree with that statement is either deluded or is a liar. Because there is a certain amount of strength, ladies and gentlemen, that comes from being a part of a group. There's a reason why in the book of Exodus, God tells the children of Israel, he says, don't follow a multitude to do Israel. There's a herd mentality that we sometimes have, where we just kind of see a group, we see an organization, and we kind of go right alongside that. There's a certain amount of strength that we get from that. And Solomon talks about that. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, starting in verse 9, look at what he says here. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, starting in verse 9. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, starting in verse 9. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, starting in verse 9, he says, two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there's not another one to lift him up. He kind of talks about the strength that you have in pairs. And there's been a lot of wedding ceremonies that people have tried to take this section here, verses 9 to 10, and ascribe it to a husband and wife. And I think you certainly can make that application. But as if not to limit it by that, he goes a step further in verse 11, and he says, if two lie down together, they can keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him, but a cord of three strands is not quickly torn apart. There is a strength, ladies and gentlemen, in numbers. There's a sense of companionship. There's a sense of power that we feel by being in this group. And as we go out into the world, we're sometimes isolated for days or hours at a time, where we don't see our fellow Christians, we feel that energy kind of draining away from us. And then we get together on Wednesday night, we study the Bible together, we sing songs together, we feel that energy pick back up, at the very least for validation that we're not by ourselves. That's what Solomon talks about. I can't count to you how many times that I've been in a Bible study with somebody, or maybe haven't been talking to somebody, and on one-on-one dialogue, I don't necessarily have the answer, which I know is a gigantic shock, that I may not have all the answers, said with the most extreme amount of sarcasm. But then somebody who is much more knowledgeable, I ask their help, they show up at the next Bible study, and all of a sudden everything goes fantastic. There's a strength that we have in numbers. There's an energy that we derive from being a part of a group. And I would argue to you, especially being a part of a spiritual group. I want you to look at Colossians, the second chapter. Colossians chapter 2. We talked about in the class this morning, for those of you who were able to catch it online, they'll be starting at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning so people can watch them and still have time to get ready in order to come to services. But we talked about in the class this morning about Paul and about how he had a very personal struggle, but he also relied heavily on the people around him. And I think those are things that we sometimes think about when we talk about Paul, because he almost seems superhuman to us. But in Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 1, he says, I want you to know how great a struggle I have on your behalf, and for those who are at Laodicea, and for all those who have not personally seen my face. I think that's an interesting phrase, because he's exhorting and he's encouraging people who have never actually personally interacted with Paul. It's one thing for Silas and Barnabas and Timothy and these people who are close to him. It's one thing for them to be encouraged by him. It's something different for people who have never actually interacted with him to be strengthened by him. But in verse 2, he carries on to this thought, and he says, that their hearts may be encouraged, having been knit together in love, and attaining to the wealth that comes from the full assurance of understanding, resulting in a true knowledge of God's mystery, that is Christ himself, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. If you break those verses down, what Paul is essentially saying there in Colossians chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 is, my job is to encourage you people. That's what Paul is saying. But he says, I draw a special amount of strength from you, and hopefully you do from me, by the fact that we are united united in our struggle towards God. Because fighting for heaven, as I can paraphrase here in verses 2 and 3, fighting for heaven is the only thing really that's worth fighting for on a cosmic, eternal scale. And that type of magnificent, gigantic battle, what we need are fellow people that can encourage us. And so Paul says, I'm encouraging you. You encourage me by our mutual edifying work that we have together in the gospel. Paul says much the same thing in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, although he expounds on this thought a little bit. Look in this chapter. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy our brother, to the church of God which is at Corinth, and all the saints who are throughout Achaia. Notice he talks to a lot of people there. Verse 2, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, the God of all comfort. That's the key word for this section, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. If you have another translation, you may not see the word comfort used about 12 times in there, but it's there at least in my verse. Verse 5, for just as the sufferings of Christ are ours in abundance, so also our comfort is abundant through Christ. But if we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation, or if we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which is effective in the patient enduring the same sufferings which we also suffer. And our hope for you is firmly grounded, knowing that as you are sharers of our sufferings, you are also sharers of our comforts. There's two things that he talks about there in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. On the one hand, he talks about the sufferings that we all endure collectively, that we all endure as being Christians, that we all endure as being disciples. There's a day-to-day type of suffering that is involved with that, whether it's external with other people or whether it's internal with ourselves, trying to rid ourselves of these temptations. But there's sufferings that go alongside the life of being a Christian every single day. But what's the second word that he uses there? The second word is comfort. And the question that I have as you look at this passage is, how could Paul, who talks so often, especially in 2 Corinthians, as you go throughout the entire book, he talks more and more about the sufferings and the pain and the things that he endures, but how can he, at least in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, talk about comfort? And if you read between the lines, what he's addressing here in terms of comfort is the comfort that he derives from each other. That I comfort you, you comfort him, he comforts me, we all comfort each other. But not just in a pat on the back, how you doing kind of way, but it's the knowledge that we're all pulling in the same direction. I'll tell you right now, and I say this without any hesitation, my faith would probably not be as strong, and you can decide for yourself how strong that is. Everyone's different. But my faith would not be as strong as I hope it is if it were not for the encouragement that I get from each and every one of you. And that's why I begin every sermon, hopefully, with talking about how great it is to be together, because I look at Sunday mornings and Wednesdays as a spiritual recharge that gets me through the rest of the week. Because I know on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, that I have at least another 100 people in Greenville that are pushing together for the sake of Christ. You give me strength. And it's my prayer that I give you strength as well, that we all give each other strength. That's the comfort that he addresses there. Look as he continues here in verse 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 8. He says, we don't want you to be unaware, brethren, of our affliction which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened excessively beyond our strength, so that we even despaired of life. That's the sufferings that he talked about in the first 7 verses. Indeed, verse 9, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a peril of death, and will deliver us, he on whom we have set our hope. And he will yet deliver us, you also, joining and helping us through your prayers, so that thanks may be given by many persons on our behalf for the favor bestowed on us through the prayers of many. We should draw strength from each other. We should draw strength from our common working together. We should draw strength from the knowledge that we're all praying for each other. That's where we get our spiritual strength. And I think it's noteworthy that when you look at 1 Kings chapter 19 and you look at that entire story of Elijah where he's in an emotional peril, he's at probably the lowest spiritual point of his life, that God talks to him at least on a few different occasions, gives him food miraculously. He runs for 2 months on that food. But it's not until verse 19 when God says that I have 7,000 people who have not bowed the knee to Baal, that's when Elijah gets up and goes on about his work. I think that's noteworthy, that we can have physical food, that we can have comfort, and we can have the knowledge that God is there, and all those things are great, but there's a certain amount of strength that's derived from not feeling like you're the only person left in the world that's trying to serve God. That's the strength that I'm talking about. And that's the strength that I'm talking about when I say that there's strength in numbers, that there are 7,000 people who have not bowed the knee to Baal. That's what Elijah wanted to interact with. That's who Elijah wanted to talk to. And that's who hopefully all of us have wanted to talk to for the last 2 months. But I think we see something else in this. Look back at 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19. Look back at that story, because the story doesn't end there. We sometimes just pull that story out of it and then go on about our life. But look at 1 Kings chapter 19. What this story also reveals to us is that we need close companions. I want you to look at 1 Kings chapter 19, starting in verse 19. Verse 19, immediately after in verse 18, where God tells him, I've reserved for myself 7,000 people who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And verse 19, what's the story that happens immediately after that? Verse 19, he departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, while he was plowing with 12 pairs of oxen before him, which, by the way, signifies that Elisha was a man of some kind of wealth. And he with the 12th, Elijah passed over to him, threw his mantle on him, and he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, please let me kiss my father and my mother, and I will follow you. And he said to him, go back again, for what have I done to you? So he returned from following him, took the pair of oxen, sacrificed them, boiled their flesh with the implements of the oxen, gave it to the people, and they ate. And then he arose and followed Elijah and ministered to him. Immediately after this big scene of Mount Carmel, 1 Kings chapter 18, where all of us would assume that's where Elijah's going to get his strength. You see the presence of God manifested on the sacrifice. That should encourage anybody. And then Elijah has that spiritual lull there in 1 Kings chapter 19. And God says, or God gives him food. And then God says that you're going to anoint these people. And then God talks to him through the wind. And then God says, I have 7,000 people who have not bowed the knee to Baal. After all of that, the very first thing Elijah does after that is go and find Elisha. And it mentions there, especially at the end of that chapter in verse 21, that Elisha follows him closely. But if you read the rest of 1 Kings and the first part of 2 Kings, Elisha does not make an appearance. You know Elisha's there. You know Elisha is in the background, that he's with them every step of the way. But the name of Elisha, at least as far as I could tell, does not pop up anywhere in this text. But you see Elijah doing some pretty amazing things. The last several chapters of the book of Elijah show these peaks where Elijah is just constantly working for God. But you know in the background, Elisha is there with them as well, to the very end. Until Elijah eventually ascends to heaven in a chariot of fire. Elisha is with him to the very end. Ladies and gentlemen, we need close companions. I derive strength from being a part of a large group. I derive strength from being a part of any size group. Whether it's 5, 10, 15, 20 people, whatever it is, as long as we're all spiritually bound together, that we're all pushing in the same direction, I derive strength from that group. But I also derive strength from people that I'm closer to than maybe everybody else. I don't know where we got this idea at some point that cliques inside of a church are bad, that churches shouldn't have any cliques. And I agree with that to a certain extent. Cliques that exclude everybody else, where you don't have anything to do with anybody, or where you don't want to help each other, where you don't really even talk to each other, those types of cliques are bad. But to my knowledge, you don't see anywhere in Scripture where cliques are described necessarily as a negative thing. As a matter of fact, in Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 20, he says, a man of too many friends comes to ruin. But there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. There are people, I would imagine, no matter who you are in this congregation, there are people in this congregation that you are closer to than me. I don't know who you people are. I don't know what parties you've been excluding me from, but I would imagine there are people that you're closer to than me. That's totally fine. Because you derive strength from people who know you, who are very much like you, who have similar interests, who have similar hobbies, who are maybe the same demographic, but people that you feel like you can be vulnerable with. And instead of running from that and having this idea that cliques are bad, I would say lean into those relationships. Don't exclude other people, certainly. Nick needs friends too. But don't exclude other people. But lean into those types of relationships. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, starting in verse 1, we don't necessarily have the time to read it, but if you read 1 Samuel chapter 18, starting in verse 1, going through verse 4, there's 4 verses there that describe David's close relationship with Jonathan. And Jonathan would be somebody who visits David in the wilderness, somebody who tends to him on at least a few different occasions, but somebody who really tries to encourage him and build him up. David had lots of friends to run around the wilderness with 400 armed people doing his kind of thing in the wilderness, but Jonathan was somebody who he leaned on. Naomi had Ruth, and when Naomi tells Ruth that you need to go on about your way, go and take your life somewhere else, get married, have family, do something else with your life, Ruth says, where you go, I will go. Where you're buried, I will be buried. And more so to me, if anything but death parts you and me. That's a friendship. That's a kinsmanship. Ladies and gentlemen, we need those close companions. We need those relationships in our life. We need to lean into those types of relationships of people that we can lean on. We need close companions, but we also need other people. One thing's for sure as we finish up this morning, not one of us, that's at least in this room, and especially the people that are online when they're back with us, or maybe even right now, none of us will ever take for granted the joy that we get from worshiping together ever again. Because for the last 2 months, all of us have been sitting inside of our living rooms. Some of us have been sitting inside our TV rooms, your home theaters, which fancy pants to you, but all of us have been sitting somewhere, worshiping God in our own homes. But the one thing that you don't have in your home is your brethren. And for at least this morning, for the hour that we have together, and for every Sunday morning for the foreseeable future, unless this thing makes an ugly return, rears its ugly head, and we have 100 more spikes, we will never take for granted the time we have right now to worship with each other, to lean on each other, to encourage one another. And I would encourage you not just to enjoy it, but to use it to build one another up. There's a story that I heard a long time ago, and I think fits it very well. There's a story of an elder who went to go visit a member of the congregation who was isolated. And it wasn't because of quarantine. This person just didn't feel like he needed to be, I guess I need to go over here. This guy didn't feel like he needed to really be a part of the worship anymore. He wasn't at services. He wasn't interacting with other people. And so the elder went and visited him. The elder showed up at his house, and this person was sitting in front of the fire, and they were sitting there drinking coffee. And this person was going on and on and on about why he didn't feel like he needed to be at services, which, by the way, is a very in vogue kind of thing to say right now, that I'm my own Christian. I don't need a church. I love God, but I hate the church. It's a very religious thing to say in a lot of circles right now. But there's a lot of people that feel like they can kind of do it themselves, and that's what this guy was all about. He said, I don't need to go to the church because I do this, 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 and this. And the elder just sat there and listened to this person for about 30 minutes. And up he came after 30 minutes. He stood up in his chair. He walked over to the fire. He took the poker, and he took one of the coals out from the fire and separated it from the rest of the fire. And for the next couple minutes, they watched as that ember that was once burning so bright slowly began to dim and eventually began to fade away. And both of them in that moment knew exactly what that elder was getting at. And the guy responded, I'll be at services next Sunday. Now, sometimes we think that we can do it alone. And certainly the first few weeks of this quarantine, we were of the mindset, we'll get back together at some point, a few weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, we'll get back together. I can hold out till then. I may even force till then. The reality of the situation is none of us are as strong individually as we are together. I need you, you need me, we need each other. And hopefully throughout this time period, we've not only learned to draw closer to God, but draw closer to each other. One thing that we haven't offered in 2 months is an invitation, but I don't want to leave this morning without offering anybody the opportunity to make their life right with God. If you need to confess of sin in your life, if you need the prayers of this congregation, if you need to be baptized, whatever the situation is, you have people that are here ready and willing to help you. I encourage you, they love you. Come as we stand and as we sing.